This evening, we are very excited to welcome Jennifer Close back to Politics and Prose bookstore. In addition to being the author of 2 previous novels, Jennifer is also a former P&P employee, so we're always thrilled to have her back at the store. Yes. Tonight, she will be discussing her latest novel, The Hopefuls, which Ron Charles of the Washington Post described as, quote, a hilarious gripe fest about what it feels like to be caught in the gravitational pull of Washington, end quote. The novel centers on a young woman named Beth who moves to D.C. from New York after her husband Matt takes a job with the Obama administration. As Matt continues to go deeper down the rabbit hole of political life, they form a close friendship with another young couple that may just be the undoing of their marriage. I will leave it to Jennifer to dig deeper into the plot, but suffice to say it is the perfect D.C. summer read that will leave you laughing about all of the frustrations and peculiarities that are unique to the Washington area and the political arena. Tonight, you may have noticed, Jennifer is joined by Tayla Burney, a producer with WAMU's The Kojo Nnamdi Show. This event is part of the WAMU in Your Bookstore series, in which different personalities from our local NPR affiliate station come to local bookstores and participate in events. We have had Tayla here with us in the past, and we are very excited to have her back. So please join me in welcoming Jennifer Close and Tayla Burney to the Politics and Prose.
Thank you so much, Alexis, and thank you all for being here, and thanks to the staff here at PNP. It's always a delight to be in this bookstore with people who are part of the community of this bookstore especially. And just really briefly, I will echo that this partnership with Politics and Prose makes so much sense for us at WAMU because it is at its core about community, it's about conversations, it's about storytelling. So we're really delighted to be here again. And really quickly, how many of you are listeners to WAMU? Show of hands. Awesome, thank you for listening. How many of you are members? Yay, double awesome. Thank you for those of you who are supporters of the station. And if you're not a listener, check us out, 88.5 on your FM dial, WAMU.org, and on the NPR One app on your smartphone, which I know you all have downloaded already. It's awesome. But as Alexis mentioned, we will take some of your questions in pretty short order, so do be thinking about that, and we'll tell you when it's time to pop on up to those microphones. But without further ado, Jennifer, it's so exciting to be here with you. Congratulations on The Hopefuls.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. This is such a happy crowd to see.
It is. It is. And, you know, Alexis gave a great overview of what the book is about in her introduction, but I wonder, it is about a lot of different things. It's about the political scene here in D.C. It's about sort of being part of a community here in D.C. It's about a marriage. It's about a couple marriages, actually, and sort of the dynamics within them. And we'll talk about some of those things. But what, at its core, is The Hopefuls about for you?
So I think for me, one of the biggest things it's about is political spouses and just sort of what they're expected and need to do. When I first moved here, I mean, there's a lot of DC gossip in here, which I think is what people are really focused on. But
it's really fun.
Yeah. But for me, I think when I moved here, I started to think about what that would be like if my partner wanted to run for office and what you're expected to do and sort of what you're willing to do. And so it was pretty soon after I moved here that the wheels started turning on that. And that's sort of what sets everything in motion. The narrator, Beth, she knows she met her husband really young, but they were young when he said, I want to run for office. So she thought, great.
Sure.
Yeah, that sounds great. And then when it started to become more real, she started to think, I don't know that I'm on board with this. So that's sort of, the first tension that comes up in the book. And the second part is just a lot about political charisma. And it's funny, I started writing this book well before this election cycle, but it's like really relevant now. And just sort of that idea that you can be really smart and really passionate and really care, but if you can't translate that to the audience, you might not get very far. And on the flip side, you can not be that smart and get a lot of people to get behind you. And that's sort of, it's fascinating and it's a little scary, and that's a lot of what I talk about in the book.
Yeah. I wonder if this story is more personal for you than your previous novels. Long before I met you, I had read and enjoyed your prior works very much. But I wonder if this is a little more close to home, or if that has always been something that has been a part of your work as an author, that your own personal experience.
Yeah, it's really funny with this one. When Girls in White Dresses came out, and I had dreamt about being an author for my whole life, and dreamt about, I talked about this once, but I used to go to bookstores and look to see where my name would be. She's really embarrassed. I know, yeah. But I used to be like, close would be right there. And I like had all these daydreams about what would happen, but one thing that I didn't know that would happen is that people would think like, oh, this is just about you, which they do, which I do too. When I read prep, I was like, oh, Curtis Sittenfeld did not like prep school. And I read Gone Girl, and I worried for Gillian Flynn's husband for like, I kind of still am. So I do it too, but I wasn't ready for it. And I think that was a really weird feeling and the more that I tried to say like, no, this story was inspired by this, but it's not true, the more people would just be like, yeah, okay, so which one are you?
Yep.
And I don't know if it's just I'm more used to it, but the characters are so not me in this book that I feel like I'm not nervous. I'm not nervous for anyone to read it. It's so clearly fiction, and I keep getting questions of how is Beth like you? And the one thing I say is she hated DC when she first moved here. I did too.
Yeah. No, I think that is such a fascinating thing whenever we've had authors on the show, or whenever people come through there's this base assumption that, or even let's talk about Lemonade, like the fact that everybody's like, oh, Jay-Z better watch out. Like it's not necessarily the case. But you did mention that you do share some traits with Beth in terms of your relationship with DC when you first moved here. And I was actually thinking about her last week. My sister-in-law lived in DC for over a decade, and she's moved to Seattle, and she's trying to convince me that the other Washington is very appealing. I do not agree. But she was saying something that reminded me of Beth, because she said, DC is just hard. She was like, Seattle, you can go to the grocery store, and it's easy. And there's this great scene early in the novel where Beth is trying to go to the grocery store, and it is a struggle for her. And you also get into like the various nicknames for all the Safeways, which I appreciate. But it inspires this epic rant about DC from Beth. Could you read that for us?
Sure. It's my favorite part of the book.
It's pretty spectacular.
This is probably was part of the first 10 pages I wrote of this book. So this is Beth. I hated everything about DC. I hated the weather in the summer, how it was so humid you could barely breathe, how you started sweating as soon as you walked out the door. I hated the way people asked, who do you work for, as soon as you met them, like that was the only thing that mattered. I hated the shorthand people used to talk about their jobs. I work at Treasury, they'd say, or at DOD, or for POTUS, or I'm in LA. It was like they didn't have enough time to say the whole thing. Like if you didn't know what their acronym meant, you didn't matter anyway. I also hated how it wasn't long before I used these acronyms, how they so quickly became a part of my vocabulary. I hated that the metro was carpeted and that it was so far underground. I still hate that so much. You felt like a mole by the time you got down the escalator. And I hated that you had to swipe your card to get in and out of the station. I hated that you couldn't eat or drink on the train, and I especially hated that everyone obeyed the rule, like they were afraid they'd be arrested for sipping a cup of Starbucks on their morning commute. I hated the helicopters that buzzed overhead, like we were in some sort of war zone. I hated how the motorcades stopped traffic, halted the metro, and clogged up the streets, usually when you were running late to get somewhere. I hated how young everyone was, especially on the Hill, how they walked around all doughy and baby-faced, wearing suits that their mothers had bought them, thrilled with the fact that they'd accepted a salary of $23,000 to work for 10 hours a day. I hated that they were all so eager, ready to tell you about their passion, healthcare or Planned Parenthood or clean water, whether you asked or not. I hated the way people dressed in collared shirts and knee-length skirts, muted suits and sensible ties. I hated that all the women looked like they'd just left an Ann Taylor store. Sorry, someone came up to me and said they were wearing Ann Taylor in honor of my book. And I hated that most likely they probably just had. I hated that so many women wore sneakers and socks with their suits while they commuted, as if it were still 1987. I wanted to pull them aside and tell them that there was no need for this, that there were very comfortable ballet flats out there that they could wear instead. I hated the way everyone wore their ID cards around their necks and tucked into their front suit jacket pockets, so that the only things visible were the lanyards, just so they could let you know that they were very important people who worked at very important places. I hated how the cabs were always dirty, how they only took cash. This is no longer true, but it was true at this time. And how the drivers never seemed to know where they were going. I hated that you couldn't order takeout past 10 o'clock unless you wanted pizza from a questionable place. I hated that I had to drive to get decent groceries, that there weren't any good neighborhood stores. I missed our neighborhood bodega. I missed it every day.
Thank you so much for reading that. I think there is so much that's relatable in that rant that, if you've lived here for years or if you've lived here for a month, you have experienced those frustrations. I wonder if there was a moment for you, or if it was a gradual sort of coming to terms for you personally, when you were like, you know what, DC is okay.
Yeah, I made friends. Yeah, some of them are here. I made friends that had nothing to do with politics. So it was actually through someone that my husband worked with, but it was a book club, and they had me there, and it was like the first time, I think since I had moved here, that there was a whole night where we didn't talk about the president once. And it wasn't because we were trying not to, it was just that like we had a normal conversation. And so once I found my sort of group, it's a lot easier to like a place. Yeah.
It is, and that's actually one of the big themes in the novel as well, that it is difficult to make and keep friends in this town, I think, in some ways. And, that's something that Matt and Beth run into. And then they meet the Dillons. What is it about the Dillons that appeals to them and sort of helps them break through some of those barriers of like, are these people sort of trying to figure out what I can do for them? Are these people going to move in a month and I'm never going to see them again? So why bother? Because it is a pretty transient place. What is it about the Dillons that's so appealing to Matt and Beth?
Well, Jimmy Dillon is the one that has that thing, just that charisma, and that people are kind of obsessed with him. So that's, I think, how they first start to become friends with him. But then his wife also genuinely befriends Beth. So they're just in the same situation, and they become really, really close. But I think they understand sort of what they're both doing there. And even though there is, even at the very beginning, maybe a little level of competition, they understand each other and they're in the same situation. So they become very close very quickly.
There's also this sense of awe to some extent when they first moved to the district. I mean, they're hot off this massive victory for the Obama administration. And there's this sense that it's a really special and wonderful thing and an exciting time. At what point do you think that starts to maybe not wear thin, but like, is there a point for them, maybe Matt especially, at which they start to become a little less enchanted either with the work or with the place, and sort of how does that play out over the course of the novel?
Yeah, I think, and there's a lot of people here that worked on the campaign, I think, or at least a few of you. It was a really special campaign, right? Like that was one of the things I wanted to sort of capture, just the way, not only that they were part of this, huge historical thing, but that they all bonded, they liked each other. And I set out to give Matt the worst jobs ever, which was not easy. I wanted him to have just really boring jobs, which in a book, sometimes my agent kept being like, these are so boring. I'm like, but that's the point. He came from this thing that the whole nation was in, and now he's sitting in an office. So I think sort of there's a little bit of reality that, yeah, you can be part of this huge movement and make history and have it be so exciting and be in Iowa when when Obama wins, but in a couple of years, you're going to be sitting in an office. So that was what I wanted to capture. It happens for Matt pretty quickly. He works in the council's office, and then he goes on to have a series of jobs that he thinks is going to get him that feeling again, but he's sort of chasing it.
And at that same time, Jimmy is out with the exciting jobs, which introduces some interesting tensions into their relationship that then continue to play out over the course of the novel. You mentioned this a minute ago, this idea that, when you go out and you're, maybe especially when you're new to the city and you've just moved here for a job and you're, sort of networking a lot and you're at these events where the first question is always, what do you do? And my colleague Martin Ostermule actually did a piece for our What's With series on why. Why is that the question? Why are we so obsessed with that? And I think, what do you think?
When I moved here, I was unemployed, so if you want to stop a conversation real quick, I would go with that. Because, I had just lost my job, and so people would be like, what do you do? And I was like, nothing, and I hate it here. And they'd be like, oh, okay, that's nice.
Yeah.
So nice to meet you.
Yeah, it's great. And then they kind of get this, like, oh, I see that person over there, and then off they go. Yeah, I can relate. But I think it is a question that we all know maybe all too well or get frustrated by. But there are other sort of touchstones, and there are some that are unique to this group in particular that might be familiar to some of the folks here in your opening scene. Can you read
great. Yes, I would love to. Okay. This is the first page, so you don't really need to know anything about it. This is what people talk about in an Obama campaign reunion. How early they joined the campaign, what they did on the campaign, who they slept with on the campaign, good hotels, bad hotels, how many Hilton points they have, Who worked for Hillary before joining Obama? This was whispered behind the backs of former Hillary staffers like it was a shameful secret, sort of like herpes. Inside jokes about lost luggage, how amazing Iowa was. Usually you'd hear someone say something like, "Weren't you in Iowa? Oh man, you should have been there. You missed out. It felt like we were changing the world." Then you'd brace yourself for about an hour's worth of Iowa stories. We were at a bar near the White House called The Exchange, which had a lot of TVs and smelled like bleach and dirty rags. Matt ordered drinks for us at the bar, and then we walked around, stopping every few seconds so he could give someone a handshake or a half hug and say, "Hey man, how have you been?" He was more hyper than usual. Being around the campaign, people made him jumpy like he'd been chugging Red Bull. All that hope and change will do that to a person. Every time he introduced me to someone, he'd put his hand on my back and push me forward a little, saying, "This is Beth, my wife." And when he'd tell me the name of the person I was meeting, he'd always include their job title. "This is Larry, an associate research director at the White House." Each time I'd say something like, "Wow, that's great." I had no idea what any of it meant, but I did my best to look impressed. Eventually, we found ourselves standing in a circle of people, listening to this guy, Billy, tell a story about one of the early fundraising events. He was animated, and everyone was hanging on his every word. "So I was driving the Senate around Minnesota in a rental car," he said. "A Ford Fiesta, I think. This was sometime in 2007. And we hit a pothole and almost lost a tire." Everyone laughed like this was really funny, so I did too, but it gave me a kind of creepy feeling. Billy was telling the story like it was about potholes or Ford Fiestas, but it wasn't. The real points of the story were, 1, Billy knew Obama when he was a senator, and he knew him so well that sometimes he just forgot he was the president now and still referred to him as the senator. Such a simple mistake. 2, he joined the campaign so early that there weren't even drivers yet, which means that Billy drove around Minnesota with Obama and shotgun. How crazy is that? How jealous is everyone? 3, and again, just to repeat it, he joined the campaign early. So early. Earlier than everyone else. Before you, definitely. He always knew Obama would be the nominee. Possibly, he was the first person in the world to know. As everyone laughed at the hilarious Ford Fiesta story, Matt put his hand on my back, and I braced myself to be introduced to someone else, but he just leaned down and whispered, "We can go soon, okay?" I nodded and tried to look like I was having fun, like I loved being at this reunion, which, by the way, was a really weird thing to call it, a reunion, because all of these people lived in D.C., and most of them worked together. If they wanted to reunite, they could do it over lunch or coffee or running into each other in the hallway. And so I just shrugged and said, "Sure, we can go whenever you want." Matt smiled at me like he knew I was lying, which I appreciated. I was making an effort to be positive about moving to D.C., but these people didn't make it easy. Everyone at that happy hour seemed just a little off in a way I couldn't put my finger on. When I mentioned this to Matt, he said, "It's all people who work in politics. Nature of the beast, I guess." But as we stood there that night, listening to another story about Iowa, I had a realization. All of the people there reminded me of high school student council members, the ones who fought for pizza lunches and dance themes with great passion. They were all so eager and borderline annoying. Was Matt one of them? Had I never noticed? Had he always been this way, or just become one of them when I wasn't paying attention?
Thank you for reading that. I think
Thanks.
we've all had that moment where we're like, everybody around me used to be like the president of their student council, and what am I doing here? Help. So I appreciate that that passage so much. And that sort of points up that same issue you just mentioned about charisma and the sort of power dynamics that are happening here. And that really is something that there's a sense of competition sort of that is part of the relationship that Matt and Jimmy have. And earlier today, when you talked to Kojo, you were talking about that too, that idea of charisma and like how much that can influence a person's chances in the political realm. How does that factor into their relationship, and how does it start to shift the dynamic between these couples as their friendship sort of progresses and moves on?
Right. So the two of the main characters in the book, Matt and Jimmy, Matt is married to Beth, and he's very, very smart. He went to an Ivy League school. He was a lawyer. He's just always known what he wanted to do. He's very motivated, very focused. They meet Jimmy, who's much less so, who it turns out started doing advance by accident, kind of didn't work in between the campaigns, had a really good time, and everyone likes him. And so he keeps getting hired back, and he keeps getting these jobs. And I think for them, when they first meet each other, they know that they need each other, right? They know that Matt knows that he's a little more fun with Jimmy, that people are going to pay attention to him more. And I think Jimmy also knows people are going to take him seriously if this is his friend. And as their friendship sort of starts to, I don't want to give anything away, but really turn into what they're doing together in their careers, I think they both start to resent each other for having what they don't.
Yeah, no, it is. It's one of those relationships where each sort of fills a gap the other has, and then tensions sort of spool out from there. And that's all we'll say about that, because you're all going to get the book and read it. The other thing you just mentioned is the marriages that are part of this novel, and each of them has a really different dynamic. And I would venture to say that each individual within those two marriages has a different understanding of what a marriage means to them. And, you know, it's something that you've explored in other novels as well. Is there something about that particular dynamic and that relationship of entering into a marriage that, you know, just really appeals to you as something to explore in your work?
To write about? I think so. And I think especially with this couple, I had them get married. I don't want to get it wrong, but I think they get engaged when Beth is like 22. And I wanted them to be so young, because I think we've all seen that happen, where people get married super young and 10 years later they're like, who are you? You know, like we were in college when we, you know, started dating. So I wanted that to play a factor. Yeah, I think marriage is super interesting. And I think it's sort of interesting the way, just like the compromise that they have to give each other, and both couples deal with that.
Yeah, I find both the dynamics at play just really fascinating in this, and Ash in particular is just a great character. This is my last question for you, and then we'll open it up to you all. So if you have questions, be thinking of them. Make your way to the microphones over here and over there. But you mentioned, actually, I think Alexis mentioned Ron Charles earlier. His Totally Hip video review of your book is, like, first of all, a big deal. So congratulations on that. And it's hilarious. If you haven't seen it, go check it out right now. I almost spit water at my computer when I was watching it at work the other day. But he sort of jokingly, very jokingly, refers to it as a woman's novel. Mm-hmm. Do you think about genre or how your work's going to be categorized at all when you're writing?
Not when I'm writing. With my first book, and anyone that read it, the cover, there's a lot that happens in publishing with, I don't think about it when I'm writing, because there's nothing really I can do, and sort of like everyone thinking the first book was about me and me just getting better about it. I kind of care less. I can't stop anyone from thinking or saying what they're going to say. I don't think anyone says the word chicklet meaning it nicely. I don't think anyone ever says, like, it's a girl's book meaning it nicely. But it's so funny, because I read mostly women authors, not on purpose. That's just what I do. Most of my readers are women, and I don't think that that's like less than at all. I mean, women are the ones that buy books. They've sort of figured that out too. So so I don't know why people think it's, an insult. So I try not to think about it, just in the way, it creeps in there. People always ask.
No, I always wonder that too, because I think I so enjoy your work because it is fun and it is smart and it is provocative, but it's not depressing. Like, I think there is this sense that for something to be, sort of worthwhile, it must be like a slog. And I don't agree with that. I think that you should read what you enjoy, and you should read work by smart people like yourself, that is thoughtful and that you have a good time reading. So I always wonder that, like, at what point in the process does it start to sort of come into...
It's a lot when the cover comes up.
Yeah, the cover, I imagine, is a big thing. And
I
love this cover.
Yeah. Oh, this cover's beautiful. This was like 50 of 50 that they tried, and it was a last minute thing, but I think it's perfect and it's really pretty. They, I've had some issues with my cover. One of my friends really fought to get a girl in a bikini off of hers, but it didn't work. But it is what it is, and people pick it up. My first cover was beautiful. It very clearly skewed towards women. But I would pick up this book even if it wasn't mine. I think it's very pretty.
I think so too. And now we will turn it over to you all for your questions. So again, if you have a question, make your way to the microphone. Don't be shy. It will not bite you. I promise. I work in radio. I've never seen a microphone bite anybody, at least to this point.
Hi. Just from hearing what you're talking about, this book sounds a lot like a Wendy Wasserstein play. Do you read any playwrights to get inspiration?
I have read. She wrote a novel as well, right? Didn't she?
A little bit.
No,
she
I'm
did
sure
most
you're
of
like
plays.
no.
She did a
I
book
don't read any play. I actually don't read plays. I am. I read very little nonfiction, and some of my students are here, and I sometimes teach nonfiction and poetry, which. No, I'm mostly just a fiction. I don't read a lot of plays, and I don't read anything.
So who
other
are
than
your
fiction.
favorite authors?
Curtis Sittenfeld is one that I love. Ann Patchett, Ann Packer, Courtney Sullivan is amazing. There's so many.
Who are you reading right now?
Who am I reading
do
right now?
you
I
have
just
time
finished
to read?
Homegoing. Yeah, this summer is like just full of books. Homegoing, which was amazing. Sweet Bitter was really great too. Lily and the Octopus. I don't know if you guys have read that. I almost just cried talking about it because it's so sad, but really good. That was a great one. And Modern Lovers by Emma Straub was great. There's this summer is like, it is full and
There's
great.
a lot of great stuff out
Yeah.
there, and there's a lot of great stuff coming for fall too that I'm really excited about.
And one last question. In the Washington Post review, they said that the couple moves to Texas. Why did you get them to leave D.C.?
So that's a good question. When I started this book, I didn't really know where it was going to end, which is sort of what's happened with all my books. Jimmy is from Texas, and I think I wanted him to be somewhere from the South. I wanted him to have an accent. I think George Bush was in my head a little bit when I wrote him, like that sort of like drawl and the cowboy. So that I think is why he was from Texas. I wanted to show a local campaign. So that was how they ended up back there. Yeah.
Did you actually? That inspires another question that I have for you. You mentioned earlier that you like to write when we were talking. Not earlier in this conversation. Sorry. When we were talking earlier, you mentioned that you like to write where you know, like write a place that you're familiar with, where you feel like you're going to get it right. Did you spend time in Texas when you were writing that part of the book, or to prepare
I
for
had
that?
been there, and I did a lot of. I talked to someone who had run for this office, and I had friends in Texas that I asked sort of where would they live, what would be a place to go. They end up in Sugarland, which as soon as this guy said the name, I was like, yeah, we're done. That's a real place. That's a real,
Sold.
yeah. No, that was hard. I mean, I think I don't want to say laziness for why I do it, but I think I don't want to mess up a neyborhood. That's what I was saying earlier. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's really smart because I know whenever I read a book about a place that I currently live or where I grew up or that I'm familiar with, I am looking for that level of detail that you bring to this book.
Yeah. And there's so much you can find online now. Like I spent a lot of time on the real estate sections and just looking at places. But I was really, really happy because I was super nervous about that part because I never lived there. And it was hard when I'd be like, oh, I want them to go to Torchy's Tacos. And then I would just have to think like, okay, is there one? I don't know where it is. So I'd have to.
Is that a reasonable thing for them
It's
to
just
do?
harder.
It's harder.
Yeah.
Anybody else have any questions they want to mosey over and ask?
Yeah, I have one. Hi. It was funny you guys talk about chick lit and what have you and the stereotypes of that. And the reason why I was drawn to Girls in My Dresses and The Smart One was I felt that the stereotypes of most women in chick lit, which I love, was kind of the lid was blown off. You definitely made it more of a raw character. And I wanted to know if you kind of set out for that or was it more your natural voice that came out when those characters came to be?
That's a good question. Girls in My Dresses, so when I was in grad school, the program that I was in was like very experimental, and there was a lot of I would never have written in first person. I would have probably never written a female character. A lot of the people there, they were so, and some of my friends, but so snobby about the big books that came out. They'd be like, I haven't read that. They were just very like they were reading the classics. So that was in my mind, and a lot of the stories in Girls in My Dresses there's some weird things in them, and it's very much like a like an MFA inspired, there's some people, Claire's laughing because she knows, cause she's been in the program. Like you just get in this mindset of, I'm going to make this different, So I think that was part of it. But Girls in My Dresses too was when I was able to sort of find my voice. I wasn't writing in my voice in grad school. I was writing, I didn't want to get bad critiques, which is like the worst way to write. So then when I started writing about women in their 20s, which, so many people were quick to they were like, oh, you wrote a Girls in New York book? Cool. Like it's like Sex in the City. But once I started writing in my voice, I felt at home, and I was able to finish that in a way that I had a book that I never finished in grad school. So,
Awesome.
yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Hi.
Hi. Can you tell us about your writing process? Are you a late night writer or early morning, or do you set aside time? What does that look like?
I am not an early morning writer because I'm not an early morning person. I tend to get up and have a lot of coffee and check emails, and I start like mid-morning, I think. Sometimes I'm a late night writer. If I'm really finishing things, there's it's really long days, and I will go late at night, and you go from like when I'm in the thick of it, I have all my like I start with coffee and I sometimes end with wine or vodka at my desk, which is a great like you can only have one and then you're like, this is amazing. Then you wake up the next day and it's not. But that's when I'm like really getting close to the end of it. In the very beginning, I handwrite. I feel like any of my students are gonna be like, oh God, that's just what she says, which I think is really important. But it's nice not to have the pressure of a blank Word document. So I handwrite in a notebook for a really long time. This book had 3 notebooks. This book I also threw out like 200 pages that never made it in about Beth's childhood, which if I had known that when I started it, I don't know that I would have kept going. But yeah, that's one thing that I've really learned to do. I don't type for a long time until I know that I have a good chunk of it.
I'm going to jump in with another question.
Sure.
You just mentioned your grad school program, and I know you teach. So how did your experience in grad school inform the way you teach, and how do you help your own students sort of find their voice and get into
what they're doing?
Yeah.
So when I started teaching at GW, I modeled it almost exactly after my fiction class that I took at Boston College, down to I had saved my syllabus and all the things that I wrote because I'm a huge nerd. But it was nice because those stories stuck with me in a way. They were important. And in the years since I've, added new stories, or if we're talking about character and there's a story I think they would really like, I go with that. But that class for me was really important because that teacher, Steve Almond, kept driving home how hard it was to write and how dedicated you had to be. Because you can have a lot of talent, but you have to sort of just do it. And I think that's the thing that people don't always know. And I started writing a book in high school, which I did throw out because it was horrendous. But I remember when I was writing it, and I was so excited when I started it, and I got to a part where I was stuck, and I just thought like, oh, maybe I'm not supposed to be a writer. This is hard for me. So that's the thing we talk about, just like practice. It's like exercise. Don't get discouraged at your first draft. You can edit, just, keep going and set aside the time and you'll be better. That's a lot of what I talk about. Yeah.
I think that's another huge, like you mentioned before, that everyone assumes your story is you.
Right.
That's another huge thing that I think people assume, that it's easy for people who are authors to magic a book out of thin air, and it's really hard work. Yeah. And most people have other jobs while they're writing books as well. Sorry, I'll stop.
Yes, I'm working on my master's degree as well, and I was in the Army also, and what brought me to DC, and I really enjoy it. I enjoy the Smithsonian's and the monuments and everything, but what I wanted to know, does your book get into the government issues such as retaliation, breach of confidentiality, and exposure is a good one?
No, someone asked me today if I was doing an interview and they said, is your book political? And I said that it made me stop for a second. No, it does not. There's not, my narrator is very non-political. She's like sort of apathetic in a way. So there are some issues they get into in Texas. Through the campaign, there's a lot about fracking. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot about fracking, which I had to learn a lot about. But it's not an issues book. It's much more of a character-driven book.
Okay, so I'm just curious. I have heard a lot about retaliation and breach of confidentiality and gang stalking.
Oh yeah, not this book.
That's the only thing that I really hate is the gang stalking, but everything else I love in DC.
Good.
Thank you.
Oh, exposure's a really bad one too. Thank you very much.
Anybody else have any questions that they want to ask? Don't be shy. See movement.
So you talked about how Matt and Jimmy are kind of two extremes. One is really intelligent and doesn't know really how to communicate in a charismatic way, and the other extreme is he's like all charisma and not much substance behind it. So I'm curious, what do you think is kind of the ideal percentage of Matt versus Jimmy for the best leader?
Oh, that's a good question. I also just felt so defensive of my characters. I was like, he's not nothing, and Matt's not like socially awkward. But that's my own no, that's right. That is a good question. I think it really helps to have a little bit of what Jimmy has. It really helps to be able to talk and connect to people. I think you can lead well if you don't have that. I don't know that you'll be elected. So I think 70-30? I mean, I think it really helps to get people excited, but I think you also need to back it up, which is all I think every day. That you have to be able to back it up. So I'm gonna go with 70-30.
Yeah, you need some substance.
Yeah.
But you also need the style.
Right.
Right? Because without the style, no one's listening to your
No.
substance. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I'll change it up and use the other mic.
I like it.
I'm going to ask you another percentage question. So you said that you're very character driven. What percentage of the story do you feel was driven by Beth as a character, and what percentage do you knew going in what was going to happen to her?
Oh, that is such a good question. Okay. I am very character driven to a fault because I think plot to me, like I could just write 300 pages about character development, which no one would read. I'm going to go 70-30 again. I mean, there's a lot that happens in the book, but Beth is actually a fairly passive character. She kind of goes along. She's not always acting on things that drive the plot forward, but her character does sort of cause some tension, I guess.
Yeah.
Does that
Being
answer your
23,
question?
Yeah,
Okay.
it does. And being 23 and just having moved into DC, like a lot of stuff happens to you that you're just like, what is going on here?
Like what? What's your best DC story?
Oh my God. I was at a party on Saturday night with like all these people from The Atlantic, and I love The Atlantic if anyone works there. It's my favorite publication. And they just all kept being like, how directly do I correspond to the editor-in-chief? And like, I'm only 2 degrees of separation from him. And I'm like, I can't with this. I work in
Welcome
healthcare.
to DC. I hope you like it.
I do.
We're thrilled to have you.
I'm actually going back to Boston. Like,
Okay.
Can I ask you one more question?
Sure.
I really like your male characters as well. I feel like
Thank you.
I loved the girls in white dresses, and they're also beautifully drawn out. But where do you draw your inspiration for male characters? Like as a woman, I kind of find it hard to write.
I feel like in my first book, my husband was like, "Am I every character?" I'm like, "You can't be greedy. No, you're none of these characters." I don't think it's any different than writing female characters in the way that they start. It's really funny with characters. They start like you don't know much about them, and I feel like it's like you get to know them, which sounds crazy, but like the more that you hear them talk and that you get to know who they are, they're not. I don't know. I guess I pay attention to people, but yeah, it's no different I think than female characters for me. If that answers your question.
It does.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank
Good.
you.
You've lived in several cities, Chicago, New York, D.C. Do you think Washington is particularly hard for women?
Lisa, that is a great question. I think not particularly hard. I mean, I think I was maybe a little bit older when I lived here, so I was paying attention to it more. No, actually, I think it is harder. I think it's harder than New York. I think that there's a lot. I think in New York there's a lot of female-heavy industries, maybe, or I don't know, but I think DC might be a little bit harder. I don't know.
And why?
Why? I think maybe because it's so buttoned up, and there's kind of a boys' club. I mean, there's boys' clubs everywhere, right? So, again, I might have just started paying attention as I got old. When I was in my 20s, I was like, New York's so fun, and not really paying attention in that same way. But yeah, I mean, my friends that work in finance in New York, I think they face challenges as women there. I think it sort of depends where you're working. If you're in publishing or in magazines where it's, dominated by women, it's maybe a little easier. But yeah, I think DC is so buttoned up. I think that there's that sort of reputation. If that makes sense. Thanks.
Do you think, to piggyback on that question, do you think it's getting any easier? Because you talked today about sort of how things have changed since, in the last 7-ish years. Do you think that's changing?
For women?
Yeah. Just because, we were talking about
I don't know that
how
I feel like I'm like not qualified to speak on. I mean, I have I have very strong opinions. But yeah, I hope so, but I think it's like change with anything else. I think that with Hillary I don't think that the people that say she's hard to listen to think that they're speaking out against women. I think when you are a woman, there are things that you're used to hearing, right? Like you're outspoken, that I think it's changing. I think there's still a long way to go. I think there's so much more scrutiny on women. You know, it's just how it is. And I think the more we talk about it, the more we'll, like the female Ghostbusters. I mean, people are really against that. It's like a very strange, I think things are getting better. I think there's a long way to go, like any other movement. Yeah.
No, I agree. I was just wondering about it in those terms of, you know, the city has changed, I think, considerably in the time that you've lived here and the time that I've lived here in the last, less than a decade. But yeah, sometimes it does feel really hard. Yeah. Just still, which it's getting better. Yeah. And my favorite tweet actually during the Ghostbusters thing was from the Merriam-Webster's folks saying that the female of Ghostbusters is Ghostbusters. So I was like, thank you, fine wordy people, for establishing that for the ladies. Right. Anyway, I think we have time for 2 more questions. Yeah. So anyway.
I actually was just noticing as you were talking about your book that when you're talking about the 4 characters, we both know what the men's jobs are, and I actually don't know what the women in your book are doing. Right. Is that because you wanted to focus on how these women are affected by their husbands' careers, and maybe they resent that?
So that was on purpose. Beth is a character, this like finding boring jobs for Matt. This was also something that wasn't that easy. I wanted her to sort of flounder. I wanted her to not, as much as Matt has a passion and he's driven, I wanted her to wish she had it, but not have it, which is so hard to write about because then you're just sitting in an apartment all day. So that was very much on purpose that, not everyone gets up and goes to a job where they think like, I'm so grateful to be doing this. Most people don't have that, I think. So I wanted that to be a big part of their relationship where she's sort of an awe and sort of jealous, but she doesn't have anything she wants to do, right? She talks about like wanting to be a writer in the way that people are like, it would be fun to be an artist. She's not pursuing it. She's not really trying to do it. So I wanted that to be a really big dynamic in their relationship. And with Ash and Jimmy, I sort of wanted to show, I listened to this super interesting podcast about the dynamic in relationships and how sort of often there's a partnership, often one is more of a support than the other. But I wanted it to be where Ash was so supportive to the point where she is so uninterested in working. She ends up working at some point, but just that she's really, in the beginning, very happy to just be there as Jimmy's support. So those were on purpose, and it was not at all. I realized later that it sort of made it seem like there was like these women, weren't as, didn't have the same sort of drive. But I needed that for the characters for the fights. Yeah.
And I think too, for both the women, they move here because their spouse got a job here. I mean, that's something I could relate to. My husband's former military, and you moved, and you're like, okay, now what do I do? Right. And it can be harder to establish a career in that situation. And I related to that piece. And I also appreciate the job that Beth eventually does get. It's DC Love, I think.
DC Love.
Yeah, which is like a local DC blog, and all sorts of shenanigans ensue. She's writing about the administration, and it's really enjoyable. Again, read the book. It's awesome. I think we have time for one last question. Yes.
I don't think this is on, so I'll just talk loudly. Hi. Can you hear me?
Hello.
Oh, hi, there it is. What is your inspiration for your characters? Do you base them off of friends or family members? And also, how do you name them?
Oh, naming is hard. So no, I'm often, the way that I start to write fiction, there's sometimes someone will do or say something, or there'll be like a kernel of a story that will start to turn. But for me, as soon as they're on the page, they're their own people. I feel like I know these people as well as I know my actual real life friends. And as for the names, I am so boring with. I think I went to Catholic school for so long, and it's like Matt, Jimmy, Brian. There's all these like. I try not to repeat them. But they're not like Beth is like such like an 80s name. It's like with this I had trouble. A lot of times it's just whatever comes to me. Sometimes if I'm emailing with someone, as I'm naming a character, I'll give them their last name. Actually, no, I have a really good story. I think I talked about this in our class. Jimmy Dillon is a real person who I have never met. He went to college with this is so embarrassing because he went to college with one of my friends. And I just always thought like, that's such a great name. And I stole it to use in a story really early on. I almost want to say it was right after college. I stole it to you just because I thought it flowed well. And when I started writing this book, I think I thought, I'll change it. but I didn't. And then he was so Jimmy Dillon at the end. And this guy who, I looked him up on Facebook. I've never met him. He is involved in politics. Which is like so, anyway, I told my friends that went to college with him, and they were like, oh, whatever. I mean, who cares? But one of my students used a real name of someone she knew, and someone in the class said, I think we're from the same town. I know that guy. And so like, it's just, real names are, really fun, but Jimmy Dillon is a good name, and I think it has a catch to it, and it fit him. So that's my naming story.
I hope he reads it.
I hope he does not. I don't know anything about him. It's so, he's gonna like think that I'm a stalker. I don't know.
No. He knows it's the creative process, right? At least we hope. Well, I think that's all the time we have. Thank you all so much for coming out.
Thank you guys so much.